Next week, we'll hear from Barry Roundtree of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. I'm not sure what the talk will be about, but I'll try to squeeze out of them the secrets of Sierra, the new supercomputer they are building, and they allege that I'm not supposed to know that. So, but next week you'll have the opportunity to quiz Barry Roundtree of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Today we were supposed to have heard from Chris Finan. He couldn't make it. And graciously, Phil Stupak stepped into his shoes, and he's going to tell us whatever he's going to tell us. Let's welcome our speaker.
Thanks, George. Before I get started, this is really something I like to have a bit more interactive experience. I know everyone here is probably going, oh, God, he's going to ask me questions. But before I get started, I'm just out of curiosity, who all is a student here? Okay, so almost everyone. Of those students, who here is a CS major? Almost everyone. Any engineers? All right. And now my personal favorite, any poli-sci students? That's what I thought. All right. So as I go through some of my remarks, there are some prepared remarks. I'll probably use some acronyms you may not be familiar with. If that's the case, raise your hand. Please ask me a question while I go. If I say NIST, please stick up your hand and go, what the heck is that? I'm happy to stop and kind of explain through some of these branches of the federal government that you may not be experienced with, you may not be aware of. So a little bit about myself. I began my federal service in Congress, where I worked in the last Democratic majority in the House of Representatives. When we lost the majority, I moved over to President Obama's administration. For 3 years, I worked at the Department of Homeland Security. Now, most people have heard of Homeland Security. Not many people know what we do. But one of the things that we do is cybersecurity defense, especially among critical infrastructure all across the nation, and also with our partners overseas. Part of my work included negotiating federal government responsibilities between the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, and DHS, kind of splitting where each of our authorities were going to lie when it came to cybersecurity work. I also reached out to the private sector in preparing for a comprehensive cyber bill that was certainly coming in 2012. As you probably know, that did not happen. So after 2012, I began working on the President's 2013 Executive Order and Presidential Policy Directive, which is where our state of cybersecurity is right now in the federal government. Within the Office of the Deputy Secretary is the number 2 person charge at Homeland Security. She's kind of like the Chief Operating Officer for a company that's about 400,000 people and operates in every time zone across the world except for 3 of them. I was her lead staffer on international relations. This meant that I worked with the European Union as the Commission wrote the General Data Protection Regulation. Is anyone here familiar with the GDPR? Okay, that helps. I'll get to that in a little bit. I also worked with the previous Indian government on joint cybersecurity matters, and one of the things I most enjoyed was working with the People's Republic of China, going to Beijing to deliver a message from the president that basically came down to stop stealing our stuff. So this is what I've been doing. I left the government about a year ago when my wife was kind enough to take a job at eBay. She's now at Google. This brought us out here. I was happy to move back to the Bay Area where I'm originally from. Since that time, I've been doing some consulting work, working with some of the companies in Silicon Valley as they try and work with the U.S. government and foreign governments to expand their products across the world. So it's from this perspective that I'm here today to talk about cybersecurity and where it may be going from the federal government's perspective. What is the federal government doing? Before I get into what is going on right now in the federal government, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the federal government when it comes to cybersecurity. The natural place to start with this, as I'm sure you're all aware, is with cutting-edge technology called the telegraph. Long before ARPANET was ever turned on, the U.S. Army Corps began working with telegraph messages going back and forth. In 1917, we entered World War I. This was in part due to the Zimmerman telegram that was intercepted by the Army. And the Zimmerman telegram was a message from the German government to the government of Mexico, essentially promising Mexico the Southwest if they were to enter the war against the United States. At this point, telegraph was the cutting-edge technology. U.S. Signals Corps was responsible for collecting, decrypting, and analyzing telegraphs going to foreign adversaries. They got quite good at it. So good that after World War I, they continued working in New York City at Western Union, where they would intercept telegraph wires coming into New York City to foreign officials, once again collecting them, analyzing them, decrypting them. They continued this work through World War II, and after World War II, President Truman set up the modern National Security Council. The NFC runs kind of the national security architecture for all of the United States. He was worried about a lot of this capability remaining in the hands of the military. Of course, the military wanted to keep their intelligence gathering activities, and so a compromise was struck where they would create the National Security Agency. I think a few people may have heard of NSA. Yeah, right. So this is kind of the birth of NSA, was in this intelligence gathering arena. And it's important to know this because it kind of creates a lens that we have when we look at NSA's activities today in cybersecurity. They began this work by intercepting messages going across cables. That's essentially what they still do today. Now, NSA remained part of the Department of Defense, but primarily operated as a member of the intelligence community. What's important for our story is that until the FBI began working on computer crimes in the 1980s, this clandestine organization, the NSA, built to collect, decrypt, and analyze foreign communications, was the sole entity working in what would become the cybersecurity space. Even today, the head of NSA is also the head of DoD's Cyber Command. Now, the FBI also began their cybersecurity capabilities through early wire fraud investigations. Again, this may not sound like cybersecurity, but when you stop and think about what they're doing, it is, in fact, the precursor to modern cybersecurity capabilities. In the late 1960s, the FBI's first investigation into hackers was launched in response to the phone phreaker subculture. Is anyone here familiar with phone phreakers? Hey, there's one. All right. Awesome. So what phone phreakers are is back long before you were born, maybe even before your parents were born, AT&T controlled all the long-distance cables in this country. But you could access them if you picked up a phone and provided a signal, a whistle, at a 2600 hertz. This would activate the long-distance cables, and then suddenly you could use long-distance calling. Does anyone here even know what long-distance calling is? Sorry, right, kidding. But you could access, they used to be very expensive, but now you could access these long-distance cables simply by creating a whistle. And what this early phone phreaker, what people would become known as hackers, discovered is that if you bought a box of Captain Crunch cereal, there was a toy inside, which was a whistle. Cover up two of these holes on the whistle, blow, and you hit the exact right note to activate these long-distance cables. And now you could call anywhere in the world for free. It was a revelation. These were young guys all across the country who were starting to realize that you did not have to pay attention to the authorities, corporate America. You could circumvent them to get what you wanted, in this case, long-distance phone calls. The same culture is what brought Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, I assume you know who they are, into the technology sphere. Wozniak built something called a blue box, which was an electronic version of a Captain Crunch whistle that you could plug in where you wanted to call. You could hold up to a phone, and then that would dial the long-distance number for free for you. Steve Jobs, being the entrepreneur, started selling these. So that kind of brought them into the business of developing technology and selling it. The FBI was also brought in to investigate them. AT&T did not like their systems being used for free and having their system circumvented by this growing hacker movement. But even then, for the FBI, if you consider where they were in the 1960s and 70s, they were concerned with stopping the communist threat that was growing throughout the United States. They were concerned about violent crime. They were concerned about the growing drug war. And this simply did not come into, it did not rise to the level of a case that agents who were on the move up really wanted to take on. So this kind of died. It was in the background. Some of these early computer crime cases were assigned them, but very few of them went anywhere. Then 1983 happens. 1983, a movie called War Games is released. Has anyone here seen War Games? Matthew Broderick? Great. All right, well, we're growing in the number of hands as I move closer and closer to modernity here. War Games was a great movie in which a high school kid hacks into NORAD and nearly launches a nuclear war. Wonderful, nice little piece of science fiction. No one took it seriously. Till later that year, a group of young hackers known as 414 accessed a non-secure government computer at Los Alamos. Suddenly, the FBI was going before Congress and testifying that a computer was basically a gun, a bomb, a forger's pen, all rolled into one, and we have no idea what these kids are doing with it. As a result, Congress started dedicating money to cybersecurity, to computer security. And at this time, before this message was delivered, the height of federal government cybersecurity was the Government Services Agency, GSA, telling people that maybe you shouldn't let everyone use a government computer. That was about it. So now, President Reagan, he signs a directive that gave control over all computer systems, not military, not secure computer systems, but all computer systems in the United States to NSA. This did not sit well with a Democratic Congress, and 3 years later, they passed they passed the Computer Security Act of 1987, which placed NIST in charge of government computers in the non-secure environment. Great. Yeah, exactly. So NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They work for the Department of Commerce. If you remember your Constitution, the federal government has the right to regulate weights and measures. This is essentially NIST. They say what are the basic measurements that we should be using. So they were put in charge of computer security to develop a series of standards that computers should use to be secure. They would become they're still very important in this arena. So now what's also interesting about this is that NIST and Department of Commerce represent the first split in cybersecurity between the intelligence community and the non-intelligence civil community of the federal government. So you now have NSA on one side doing their offensive capabilities overseas, and you have NIST setting computer security standards at home. Government was now legitimately tackling cybersecurity. GAO, congressional oversight, was important. FBI was beginning to launch more and more domestic investigations into computer crimes. And NSA was honing their offensive capabilities overseas. But progress was largely relegated to the private sector, especially with the end of the Cold War and no longer seeing Russia as an existential threat to the United States. The overblown preparations for Y2K. Again, anyone here remember well, you don't remember Y2K, but are you aware of what Y2K was? Wow, that few. All right, so computer systems, long time ago, it was important if you could save any bits in your code. And as a result, a year was always set by 2 digits. So it was 87, not 1987. This saved valuable memory space for your code. Well, as year 2000 was coming along, there were all these predictions that computer systems all across the world were going to come to a screeching halt because computers would not recognize 2000 and would think it was 1900. So there was a huge movement in this country to reprogram all these legacy systems to handle the Y2K turnover. Everyone, I see a few people shaking their heads at how ridiculous. Absolutely. We spent, low estimates were about $100 million. High estimates about $10 million to do, $10 billion with a B, to do this changeover all across the country. This was largely seen as an overblown reaction to something that was not really a threat. Countries that barely spent this money didn't see planes dropping out of the sky. They were just fine. And finally, also in 2001, with September 11th, the focus was no longer on hackers or on this sort of technology use, but rather was on stopping terrorists overseas. So as a result, despite having growing cyber threats in 1990s and early 2000s, the federal government largely just had a sheepish response. Congress, the president, didn't do much. Then the Bush administration comes on in. First, they create the Department of Homeland Security, which would have a very large impact on federal government cybersecurity work in the coming years, but that time was not seen as a core mission for the department. In fact, the Homeland Security Act authorized additional collection authorities for NSA, telephone, ISP bulk collections, and also established new computer crimes directed at hackers, but didn't really consider the issue of who was going to be in charge of cybersecurity for the federal government. President Bush also took two major actions on cybersecurity, which is important to keep in mind. The first was the National Strategy to Secure Cyberspace. It was supposed to be released in September 2002. Early versions mandated firewalls for always-on internet connections. It mandated a cybersecurity fund that companies would have to pay into. And it also required restrictions on government use of Wi-Fi. All those were scrapped. And so by the time this was actually rolled out in February 2003, it lacked any new regulations. This more or less aborted attempt to secure cyberspace demonstrated a critical flaw that I think still exists today, and that's that legislators are inherently cautious towards technology, especially cyber legislation. They fundamentally do not understand it. It scares them. So they listen to experts on both sides who are naysayers. They're talking about what will go wrong if you pass this bill, and as a result, there is stasis in government. They don't do anything. This has become a growing problem, I think, in Congress at the federal level for all sectors, but especially in anything that touches on technology and computers. You have people who were born in Congress before there was TV. They do not understand this. Now, on the positive side, the National Security Strategy to Secure Cyberspace did highlight the need to secure critical infrastructure control systems, which are extremely important today, as well as develop a cyber information exchange center. Slightly less important, but still something that we're grappling with today. By the end of his administration, President Bush made another cybersecurity push by promulgating Presidential Directive NSPD 54, HSPD 23. These are names for presidential directives directing national security and homeland security work. But it placed DHS in charge of coordinating government cybersecurity efforts with OMB oversight. This directive was also the first to really expand the cybersecurity enterprise beyond the traditional NSA, FBI, NIST, DHS realm, and instead made cybersecurity a whole of government enterprise, something that every agency within the federal government was responsible for doing. It specifically directed state, energy, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to take actions in support of Homeland Security, as well as telling all other governments that you're subservient to DHS's control in this space. So now, think about this for a second. The first attempt for President Bush in 2002-2003 leads to no new regulations. And by the end of his term, he's putting Homeland Security in charge of all civilian cybersecurity. What had changed? Why? Put quite simply, what had changed was China and Russia. You saw the launch of the Georgian attacks by the Russian patriotic hackers, which was one of the first to demonstrate that a government could be taken down in cyberspace. Part of the problems for the Estonian government was that much of their software that the government relied upon was not properly updated. It was not even paid for. And so it's susceptible to cyber hacks from Russia. And Russian patriotic hackers took advantage of this fact. We also saw something during the Bush administration that is now in the news quite a bit, but was a state secret at that time, and that's the degree to which China had hacked our systems. They had hacked the federal government and the private sector. When I say they stole an ungodly amount of documents, that's putting it mildly. It was the equivalent of every minute backing up a semi-truck to every single federal government building, taking out every piece of paper they have and driving away with it. What we saw here is that cybersecurity was no longer concerned just with hackers, petty criminals stealing credit card information, or people defacing websites, but now it became a tool of state governments to conduct espionage against other governments, or also to be used as cyber warfare. This still is with us today as we are concerned about these exact same actions from Russia and China, also growing Iran and occasionally Israel. So this kind of the background that takes us into very recent time here. I assume that all you now remember 2012. Kidding. 2012, Congress made a real attempt at trying to pass cybersecurity legislation. This was the first time that they really took this on and took it on quite seriously. There were 2 bills in the House, which was controlled by the Republicans, 2 bills in the Senate, which were controlled by the Democrats. The House bill was the first to make it out. It was called the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act. It was essentially an intelligence reform package. It did not put DHS in charge and was more concerned with information sharing. Information sharing meaning feeding information into the intelligence services. President Obama issued a veto threat saying that he was very concerned about the privacy protections that were lacking in this bill and worried that would lead to NSA snooping on Americans. I don't think anyone here can possibly imagine that the NSA would ever snoop on Americans. So that bill was essentially dead on arrival when it reached the Senate. The Senate Democrats attempted to pass a bill called the Cybersecurity Act of 2012, which put DHS in charge and also gave NIST the authority to issue mandatory standards for critical infrastructure. This was a major difference with the Republican bill, where there were voluntary standards at best, if any. And this was a point of contention between the Republicans and the Democrats that eventually led to all bills sinking. So none of them were passed by the time we came to the end of Congress. Contributing factor to this was, of course, the presidential election in 2012. Neither side wanted to cede ground that could be seen as helping the other. So in the wake of the failed cyber bills and President Obama's re-election, he issued an executive order, 13636, as well as Presidential Policy Directive 21. What these essentially did was push the cybersecurity envelope for the government as far as it could go without congressional action. I was part of the team that reviewed the actions that we could take and made a recommendation to the president, most of what made it into this executive order. The couple major things that it did was reaffirm President Bush's executive order that said DHS is in charge. As a guy at DHS, we like this. It also followed up on some negotiations that we had with NSA that basically said, you stick to offensive capabilities overseas, we'll stick to the defensive capabilities here at home. DHS is in charge of securing the .gov space, as well as critical infrastructure in the .com space. DoD remains in charge of the .mil space. The other thing that it did was it created, told NIST to develop voluntary standards that industry could adopt. And in order to do this, we went through a year-long process where we held, I believe, 8 meetings with industry around the country to get their feedback on every draft on what should these voluntary standards look like. This was probably the most controversial part of the executive order. Republican opposition was pretty strong to it, despite the fact that this voluntary standard was included in John McCain's Security Act, which did not make it out of the Senate. Since those standards were released 1 year ago, and I think it's 1 year ago today or tomorrow, few have criticized the efficacy of the guidelines, but many in industry have been concerned that these guidelines may become a standard of care in legal cases. I'm a lawyer by training. Personally, I think that that's probably a good thing to tell industry you need to do this much, and if you do this, you will not be guilty of negligence. Right now, there are no standards. They do not know what they have to live up to in order to prevent a finding of negligence against them. So another critique has been lack of incentives to use the guidelines. This is the biggest thing that we heard from industry constantly was, well, if you gave me liability protection, I would use these guidelines. And it was something that we talked about, for probably about 6 months on what kind of incentives we could offer the private sector for them to take in order to adopt these voluntary standards. Unfortunately, at the end, we decided that we simply lacked authority from Congress to offer any incentives to adopt these standards. So that takes us through 2013. 2014 was last year, the 113th Congress. I can't say they were silent on cybersecurity because they were silent on everything. This past Congress was set to be the least effective in the history of the United States government up through November. Of course, last year was not a period of time that was silent for cybersecurity. We saw obviously the North Korean hack of Sony Pictures. There was the iCloud hack. There was breaches at Target, Home Depot, and continued Chinese cyber spying on the U.S. government, with several high-level agencies announcing that they had been hacked by the Chinese government. So only last month, before the 114th Congress convened on January 3rd this year, the last Congress passed 4 cyber bills. Rather miraculous, if you've been following this, that they pass anything, much less 4 bills. So let me move through those real quick. The first was the Federal Information Security Management Act Reform of 2014. What this did was update the last FISMA, which was passed in 2002. FISMA, Federal Information Security Management Act, supposedly works on cybersecurity by providing CIOs base minimum standards that they have to abide by for the federal government. Unfortunately, this act was largely seen as requiring a whole lot of paperwork and not a lot of security. So the FISMA reforms that were passed in 2014 formally recognized President Bush and Obama's executive actions, placing Homeland Security at the center of civilian cybersecurity defense. I'll just wave my arms here. It reminds me of the days that the government was shut down and I was the only one in the building. You go use the bathroom, the lights go off on you. It also, the FISMA reforms also embraced DHS's move towards a constant diagnostic mitigation system. Is anyone here familiar with Einstein 1 or 2? Okay. These were the early intrusion detection systems that Homeland Security developed and began using on their servers. Einstein 3 was supposed to be rolled out that would be an automatic system. Instead, the idea behind Einstein 3 was that you would place it at Verizon, other ISPs, and all traffic to the federal government would be filtered through this magic black box developed by NSA. One of the problems that we saw was that this black box by NSA did not exist. They refused to offer us the latest signatures, and it simply was not fast enough to handle the traffic that was coming through federal government systems. So instead, what was developed was constant diagnostic mitigation systems. Originally it was called monitoring, but after Edward Snowden, people decided monitoring may not be the best M word to use. And so what this does is it automatically monitors networks, detects intrusions, and mitigates unauthorized access by sealing off that entry port. And then alerts the IT department that we've got a problem. So that was inside FISMA. Next up was the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act, which Congress embraced the EOPPD by President Obama by kindly granting Department of Commerce and NIST the authority to develop voluntary standards. We're still not hitting mandatory standards, but they have agreed with the EO that they attacked a year earlier. Then there was also a National Cybersecurity Protection Act, which formally recognized DHS's NCIC, the National Cybersecurity and Communication Integration Center. It's this really cool building with really big monitors that, in theory, monitors all real-time activity across the United States and world for new viruses, new hacks that are occurring, and in theory will share this information with private sector where it's warranted. So despite the NCIC being put in place, I think in 2004, it was only formally recognized by Congress, given a budget in 2014. And then the last bill that they passed was a rider to the Budget Patrol Agent Pay Reform Act. Basically what this was for the cyber workforce. If there's anyone in this room who might be interested in cybersecurity, this should really perk your ears. Normally to work for the federal government, you have to jump through hurdles that will last 1-2 years. It took me almost a year to get involved, and I was a political hire. So what the cyber workforce reforms do is remove a lot of that's staying in the way of us hiring on talented computer scientists, network specialists, engineers to work on cybersecurity for the government. I strongly recommend everyone in this room consider federal government service when you graduate. There's really, honestly, nothing better. The pay sucks, the hours are long, but you're doing something that matters. Right? So now, while I welcome the 113th Congress's 4 bills, the biggest problem is that they don't do anything. All they did was recognize the status quo. This was what the president had already done. President Bush, President Obama, and they're merely recognizing it, giving it the blessing of Congress. So that was the end of last year, bringing us into 2015. I'm almost done with history. Last month, President Obama proposed 3 new cybersecurity initiatives that you may have read about. We'll cover those in a few moments. It continued in his State of the Union address when he said, "No foreign nation, no hacker should be able to shut down our networks, steal our trade secrets, or invade the privacy of American families, especially kids." I wanted to quote that because I think it's a great mission statement for the U.S.'s approach to cybersecurity, and it's also something that's profoundly different from the approach to cybersecurity we previously took. It talks about privacy. Privacy has become an integral part of cybersecurity. This past year, not many people, maybe the people in this room do, but not many people care that iCloud could be hacked with a blunt force approach. What they do care about is those pictures from last week's frat party getting on social media. Privacy has become something that we are concerned with more and more. American culture following 9/11 bent towards security. Few cared if the Patriot Act allowed the FBI to review books you checked out from the library, but these were seen as infringing on the privacy rights of terrorists. We're fine with that. Few thought that the FBI would systematically pull the entire library history from every American, with certain seemingly benign titles mandating a secondary search of your video rental history. Yet that's essentially what Edward Snowden revealed about the NSA. Maybe we're not okay with that. So now integral to the discussion of security, and perhaps especially cybersecurity, is this notion that privacy must also be protected. Let's talk about where that balancing line is in the current debate. It's easy to assume that the old security-privacy alliances still hold, with Republicans concerned about security, Democrats concerned with privacy. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Instead, I think of this as a split between being a function of who's in and out of power. The president from either party is charged with keeping the nation secure and has the full weight of law enforcement, military, and intelligence services to do so. Should security be breached, then no one will accept privacy as a legitimate excuse for failing to maintain security. Meanwhile, in our adversarial system of government, whomever is out of power will suspect that the security powers of the president may be used against the minority faction. When the Patriot Act was created, this did align the traditional privacy liberals against security conservatives. But now what we're seeing are conservatives who feel that security apparatus of the federal government may be used against them. Democrats have become security hawks. So now there's an odd alliance between traditional liberals and Tea Party conservatives on the issue of privacy. Normally, the security wing of Congress forms the establishment, but privacy insurgents have gained steam. One example, a disgruntled establishment hawk, Senator Dianne Feinstein. I hope everyone here knows who she is. She was pushed too far by NSA's version of cybersecurity and CIA's actions, and she released a blistering report on privacy protections. And she's one of the more hawkish Democrats in the Senate. So we kind of get to the question of what is Congress going to do moving forward. As we discussed, the 113th Congress passed some cyber bills, and many consider their work to be done. But I think those bills, really, as I mentioned, did not do a whole lot. Instead, what this Congress should probably focus on is legislating the areas that the president was unable to tackle in the executive order. Specifically, federal breach preemption, mandatory NIST standards, and online privacy bill of rights. Each of these has significant obstacles to overcome in Congress, and unfortunately, I do not think the likelihood that any of them will be passed is very high. Congress has been trying to pass a federal preemption of state breach laws so that companies have a single regulatory regime when they have been breached. That sounds like an easy win, but unfortunately, there's a great deal of space between Democrats and Republicans over whether to include tort immunity in any breach legislation. Businesses want to limit their exposure to lawsuits following a breach. This is the ultimate incentive that was requested during the NIST hearings. And with Republicans controlling Congress, I do anticipate that a breach bill that includes open-ended tort liability is a strong possibility of passing. But there's an equally strong possibility that the president may threaten to veto it. Unfortunately, the next issue that I talked about, NIST standards, there's no way that mandatory NIST standards are going to come out of this Congress. The Republican caucus is just adamant that there will be no new business regulations. This is what sunk President Bush's progressive cybersecurity strategy in 2002. It's what stopped rural reform in 2012. And with the polarization of Congress, any new regulation regardless of its sensibility, is seen as potentially endangering the reelection of Republicans from traditionally safe seats. And that, unfortunately, accounts for roughly 90% of them. Now, I do think there's an outside chance that Congress may advance a privacy bill of rights, though I think it's unlikely, absent an outside provocation that pushes Congress to action. The Republicans in control of crafting cyber legislation have shown little concern for including privacy protections. The Tea Party activists who are in Congress, who are concerned with privacy, have not gained enough seniority nor seats in the right committees to push their agenda forward in Congress. But there is a slim chance for this to advance because of the rise of libertarian Republicans like Senator Rand Paul, who trust neither government nor the private sector with your data. I can envision a scenario in which Rand Paul, who is running for president, needs to gain some space between himself and his Republican adversaries, and seizes on a new data breach to reach across the aisle and demonstrate that he, singularly among his rivals, understands the threats facing the modern world, has new ideas, and will respect American privacy. There's an outside chance this may happen. But I think important in that scenario is also to appreciate that the 2016 presidential election is occurring right now, which means very little will get done. Surprisingly, this means that Congress really has a narrow window of about 6 months after a presidential election to get anything done. After that, it's politicized into elections. So now, this is all with the status quo. I do think that there are certain outside provocations which may push Congress to act. Specifically, Chinese or North Korean hacking into a classified network and stealing military hardware could prompt congressional action on data breach coverage and mandatory NIST standards for critical infrastructure, especially the defense industrial base. We call it DIB base. Imagine for a second, the Chinese have an aircraft carrier that cannot launch aircraft. It doesn't have a catapult system that can push them into to enable those aircraft to take off. But now imagine they are able to hack into General Atomics, who's developing the next generation catapult system for U.S. aircraft carriers. If they get that capability, it's a game changer for Southeast Asia. This would be a real prod to Congress to take up, I think, breach legislation as well as mandatory NIST standards. Similarly, as the Ukrainian war progresses, imagine if Russian patriotic hackers want to demonstrate the threat to NATO and hack several NATO websites. This may also push Congress to action. Now, I'd like to talk just for a few minutes about what President Obama is going to be doing this year and what he might be going forward with here. First, the President proposed several new pieces of legislation focused on increased information sharing, law enforcement powers, privacy laws. He's pushing specifically a Personal Data Notification and Protection Act, Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights, Student Digital Privacy Act, Smart Grid Customer Data Privacy. All these have actually received warm reception on the Hill, and I hope that there will be some action on it. I, again, do not anticipate that Congress will take these up, absent an outside force pushing them. One of the other reforms that he announced actually earlier this week is the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center. This is a new agency that he's standing up to take cyber threat information, put it together for the federal government, and analyze it. The big question that I've heard is why? Congress has just recognized NKIC, which essentially does this exact same function. And the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center works in the intelligence side of the government. This is problematic to being able to get anything done. Largely because the most pressing information sharing need is for government and private sector to work together before major breaches occur. For example, it has been reported, I have no inside knowledge on this, but it's been reported that NSA had proof of North Koreans' motivations and capabilities before the Sony hack, but said nothing to Sony. This is the kind of information sharing between the government and the private sector is typically not done because the government does not want to expose their foreign assets or capabilities to the private sector. Meanwhile, in the post-Edward Snowden world, the private sector is reluctant to be seen working too closely with American intelligence services. As a result, I really think this new agency may not get a lot of traction or be all that helpful to the larger debate. That kind of takes me to what President Obama has done right now, the likelihood of congressional action, and I also see that time is starting to run out here. So I think what I'd like to do is take questions that you may have kind of on where we've been, what Congress has been doing, what Congress may do, and what the President may do. So at that point, maybe I can open up for some questions. Yeah.
What do you think the president might try to push forward with the Cyber Summit this Friday?
Yeah. What I just talked about intelligence services and business kind of holds true. The CEOs of Apple, Google, Facebook were all invited, and none of them are going. It's part of the problem as these businesses become global. They do not want to lose their business in the European Union by being seen as too close to the U.S. government. This is unfortunately the reality of what has happened as a result of Edward Snowden. We have a very large problem and gulf between the EU and the United States. This gulf is only increasing and may actually threaten the ability for these companies to move data from the European Union back to the United States where most of their servers are. So let me just state right now that I think it's a great outreach, but unfortunately I don't think businesses are going to take adequate advantage of having the president at Stanford. I think this is the first address by a president at Stanford in 20 or 30 years. So I would hope that tomorrow marks an occasion where the private sector and federal government can start seeing eye to eye on the need to secure cybersecurity, cyberspace. I don't know if much will change. No, sorry. Other questions? Yeah.
Outside of what you said, we could ask, who represents security, private or military, in the Joint Chiefs? Has it risen to that level?
Well, with the creation of U.S. Cybercom, it is a command in the U.S. government, in the military. It's on par with Eurocom, Africom, Asiacom, PACCOM, all these major battalion commands.
That's for the military, right?
Right, for the military, that's right.
There's no one, is there a cabinet level position representing security, cybersecurity?
Homeland Security. Homeland Security would be the primary department that's representing cybersecurity. Now, with all these agencies, though, taking on cybersecurity, it becomes one of those that many agencies have seen this as a way to get more money from Congress. So they say, oh, we've got this great cybersecurity capability, just let us do this. We need $200 million to do it. And in fact, you may be aware of the budget problems over the last few years. Sequester, one of the only agencies that saw their budgets go up was Homeland Security, and that was for cybersecurity protection. So this is becoming a cash cow, I think, for some agencies to say, we do cybersecurity to try and get more money. But yes, Homeland Security is the cabinet department that is responsible for this. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, 2012 with the whole outcry of the whistleblower was first posed.
Yeah.
Did any of the public outcry affect any of the indecision that was going on?
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's difficult enough to pass anything in August before a presidential election. But then when you have a split Congress and public's outcry over SOPA the previous spring, I think really made even the Democratic allies on the Hill reluctant to take on this and worried that it might cost them their seat. Any other questions here? Yeah, please.
Your stance on net neutrality?
Yeah, I think the president is absolutely right. I think the FCC is right to reclassify it as a utility. It's too important to our daily lives, right? Imagine if you could be charged a different rate for your power use based upon what you're doing inside your home. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. This is a great money maker for the ISPs, but let's assume that we don't move towards net neutrality. I think that moneymaker is going to largely disappear as Google Fiber is rolling out, and there's other industries that are starting to challenge them, dish networks on delivering internet capabilities, moving it away from the telecom and the cable companies. So that I think that this would largely fall apart anyways, but we're going to go down a rabbit hole if we don't reclassify, where it's going to be difficult to dig out of, even though it is no longer relevant to their business models. So I think it is wise for the FCC to reclassify it. I think it's wise to push net neutrality as much as possible. Oh, sorry. Great. All
What's
right.
the, how good a relationship does NIST have with the NSA?
Let me pass on that question. I'm trying to think of what I can say in a non-secure environment. So let me pass on that. And let me take this from a slightly different angle then and say that I do think NSA is re-embracing their critical mission, which is foreign assets and operating outside the United States and doing intelligence analysts. A little bit, maybe perhaps a little less collection work. I think what we saw over the last few years, some of the revelations, some of the things that we have heard in the news, is a sign of what I talked about earlier with Congress not understanding technology, many people in the federal government not understanding technology, and rather saying, oh, it would be great if we knew X. Does anyone know how we could know X? Oh, I got a buddy at NSA. And overeager middle management, lower perhaps, doing things that they should not have. Hacking Angela Merkel's phone, right? If that was them, when a lot of that was revealed, I was on the private side. I have no insider knowledge here, but if that was them, that was probably a step too far. And I think a lot of that is starting to be pulled back in again. Part of it was Keith Alexander, the military's guy there. He understood this world better than anyone else, and it was his own personal fiefdom. And I don't know if that's the best way to run this. I think that's where we saw some daylight between Department of Defense, Homeland Security on who should run what kind of security. And with Homeland Security gaining more authorities, gaining more capabilities in civilian cyber protection, I see them stepping into the role of being the department handling cybersecurity and having NSA not really stepping into the defense side. Does that kind of answer the question?
That was one good way to pass it.
Yeah, it's always it's the problem with clearance, right? You can't talk about a lot of stuff.
My colleagues in the private security businesses, they all shoot their heads when the government came so quickly to blame everything on North Korea.
Yeah.
They have serious doubts, and I've seen a lot of information that puts that to doubt.
Mhm.
What's your take on it?
So this is one that I can talk about freely, as I was not in government during this time, but rather having my own experiences and background. I personally have seen a lot of those doubts, and I express doubt about their doubt. I am pretty convinced that what the government has said about North Korea is accurate. The exact methodologies have only really been speculated upon, but I do see that as an accurate 30,000-foot portrayal of what happened with Sony.
Any questions from anybody? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.